For months, staff at a wealthy billionaire's estate noticed something strange. Every morning, just before sunrise, his young autistic son would quietly sit by the front door with a teddy bear in his arms, never speaking, never asking for anything. Most ignored it, thinking it was just part of his condition. But one woman, the new maid, began paying closer attention. Day after day, she watched the boy follow the same quiet routine, always waiting, always looking toward the entrance, as if expecting someone. Then one stormy night, she woke up and saw something that made her heart stop. What she discovered would not only change the way she saw the boy, but also uncover a painful truth no one in the mansion had dared to face. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. In the center of Connecticut, surrounded by tall iron gates and old trees, stood the Campbell Mansion. It was a massive house with stone walls, long hallways, and tall windows that rarely opened. The place looked impressive from the outside, but inside it felt cold and empty. After Richard Campbell's wife died, giving birth to their son, he buried himself in his job at the top of the financial world. He worked long hours and traveled often. The house became more like a hotel to him, just a place to sleep. His son, Ethan, now 8 years old, lived in that huge mansion, but it was like he wasn't really seen. Richard barely spoke to Ethan. He left the boy under the care of staff. Nannies, doctors, tutors. No one really connected with Ethan. Everyone followed instructions, but no one showed love. The house was full of things, expensive and polished, but it lacked any feeling of warmth or family. Ethan had autism and didn't speak. He made no sounds and avoided eye contact. He spent most of his time alone in his room, which was neat and quiet. His toys were always arranged in perfect lines or patterns. If someone touched or moved anything, he would notice immediately and quietly fix it. He didn't like being touched and rarely responded when people tried to talk to him. Instead, he communicated with small movements, pointing at something he wanted or looking directly at something important. Most adults around him didn't understand these signals. To them, Ethan was simply a child who didn't talk. But inside, he was always watching, always feeling. He knew who entered his room, who stood too close, who tried too hard. The staff followed routines, doctors gave updates, but nobody stopped to think about what Ethan might be feeling. His silence was misunderstood, and his emotions went unnoticed every day. Richard avoided spending time at home. When he was there, he stayed in his office or in his private room with the door closed. He rarely joined meals or spent time with Ethan. When they crossed paths in the hallway, Richard barely looked at his son. If Ethan reached out with a gesture or stood still waiting for something, Richard would often walk away or pretend not to see. To him, being a father was something he couldn't handle. His grief over his wife's death turned into distance from his son. Sometimes he blamed Ethan silently for the loss. Instead of trying to understand or bond, he used work as an escape. Meetings, phone calls, and reports filled his schedule. At night, he stared at screens instead of looking at photo frames. The mansion felt more like a workplace than a home. Ethan, meanwhile, waited quietly in his world, hoping for someone to truly see him, even though he had already learned not to expect it. Inside Ethan's room, things always stayed the same. There was a shelf with books he never read but liked to touch. He had toy cars, wooden blocks, and puzzles with missing pieces that he refused to throw away. The floor was clean, the curtains always closed. He spent hours repeating the same actions, spinning a wheel, lining up figures, or tapping the wall softly with one finger. He didn't cry. He didn't laugh. His world was quiet, controlled, and predictable. It was the only way he felt safe. When someone came in without knocking, he would freeze, waiting for them to leave. If they talked too much, he covered his ears. Most people gave up trying after a while. They left him alone, thinking that was best. But Ethan still noticed everything. He noticed when someone was sad, when someone was angry. He felt it. Even if he didn't speak, he had a deep understanding of the moods around him. No one realized how much he noticed. The other people in the house came and went. Nannies quit. Tutors changed. Doctors visited once a week and asked him questions he never answered. They always spoke in front of him like he couldn't understand. They said words like development, progress, delay, and wrote things down in folders. The staff kept the house running, meals served on time, rooms cleaned every day, lights turned on at 6, off at 9. Everything was scheduled. But nothing ever changed emotionally. No one hugged Ethan. No one sat with him just to be close. Everyone kept a polite distance, afraid of doing the wrong thing. Ethan's sadness didn't show in loud cries or tantrums. It was quiet. It was in the way he stared at nothing for hours, or how he waited at the door sometimes, expecting something that never came. The adults didn't see that. They thought silence meant peace. They didn't know it meant loneliness. His eyes were always telling the truth, but no one looked long enough to see. And so the days passed inside the Campbell mansion. The halls remained silent except for the sound of footsteps or the occasional clink of silverware. Richard continued his life outside, avoiding the place as much as possible. Inside, Ethan continued his routines, his quiet movements, his isolated world. The house had everything money could buy: art, furniture, gardens, but it had no warmth. No laughter echoed through the halls. No shared meals filled the dining room. It was a beautiful building, but not a home. Ethan stayed in his room, arranging his toys, waiting. His needs were met: food, clothing, care. But his emotional world remained untouched. No one sat beside him just to be there. No one asked what he was thinking or feeling. His loneliness was written in the stillness of his hands, the tilt of his head, the way he sometimes looked at the door as if expecting someone to finally walk in and stay. But no one ever did. And the house remained silent. Grace Miller, a 32-year-old woman, started her job as a housemaid in the Campbell mansion on a Monday morning. She arrived early, carrying a small backpack and wearing simple clothes. Grace was used to working hard and didn't expect kindness or conversation from anyone. She had worked in many large houses before, but this one was different. Everything was quiet, too clean, and people barely spoke to each other. She met the head housekeeper, who quickly explained the routine. Grace listened carefully and didn't ask questions. She needed the job. As a single mother, she had learned to be strong and stay focused. On her first day, she didn't meet Richard Campbell, but she was told about him. She also heard about his son, Ethan. When Grace saw the boy in the hallway for the first time, she noticed something right away. He didn't speak or move much, but his eyes were filled with something hard to ignore. There was sadness in his expression that stayed with her. Grace had worked with special needs children before, so she understood that they needed patience and respect. She didn't try to talk to Ethan directly or force him to respond. Instead, she simply acted normal around him. If he was nearby, she kept doing her work. She didn't stare or ask him questions. She spoke softly when needed, always making sure her actions were calm. At first, Ethan only watched her from a distance. He never made a sound or came too close, but Grace could feel that he was curious. A few days later, she noticed he had followed her into the kitchen. He didn't say anything. He just sat on a small stool while she washed dishes. She didn't mention it. She kept working like nothing had changed. Each day, he came a little closer. Sometimes he stood behind her while she cleaned. Other times, he walked behind her outside while she watered the plants. He still never spoke, but he stayed near her. As the days passed, Grace continued her routine. She cleaned the house carefully, followed the schedule, and didn't cause problems. But every time she entered Ethan's room, something felt strange. The room was always neat, like the rest of the mansion, but his bed stood out. It was perfectly made, the sheets smooth, the blanket tight. At first, She thought maybe someone else came in before her. But after checking with the other staff, she learned that no one else was assigned to that room. She started to pay closer attention. Every single morning, it was the same. No wrinkles on the blanket. No sign that the pillow had been used. It didn't make sense. She looked around the room, but never found anything unusual. Toys were always in order. Nothing was broken. Nothing looked touched. Grace felt confused, but decided not to speak about it yet. She didn't want to bring attention to something she couldn't explain. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe she'd understand later. Despite the quiet atmosphere in the house, Grace didn't let it affect her work. She kept her focus on doing things right. Most of the staff were distant and only spoke about tasks. No one seemed interested in talking about Ethan. If someone mentioned him, it was always about his condition or his behavior. Grace didn't like how they talked, like he was just a list of problems. She never joined those conversations. To her, Ethan wasn't a problem. He was a boy who needed care, attention, and time. Each small moment she shared with him mattered. She noticed that if she hummed softly, he stayed near her longer. If she moved slowly and didn't make sudden noises, he didn't leave the room. She was careful with everything: how she walked, how she touched objects, how she placed things back. It wasn't fear, it was respect. Grace understood that trust takes time. She didn't expect fast changes, but deep down, she hoped that Ethan would one day feel safe with her. One afternoon, while Grace was organizing the kitchen drawers, Ethan came in and stood silently in the doorway. She looked over and smiled gently, then went back to her task without saying a word. A few minutes later, she heard soft footsteps behind her. Ethan was inside the kitchen now, looking around. He didn't touch anything, just watched. Grace slowly slid a clean spoon toward the edge of the counter near where he stood. He looked at it, then looked at her. She didn't move. After a moment, he picked it up, held it for a second, then placed it back on the counter. That was it. A small moment, but important. Grace didn't say anything out loud, but inside she felt something shift. These tiny steps were meaningful. She wasn't trying to fix Ethan or make him behave differently. She just wanted him to feel safe being himself. She also noticed something else. He never looked afraid of her. He was silent, yes, but not uncomfortable in her presence. Every day, Grace returned to Ethan's room to clean, and every day the bed remained untouched. It still bothered her, but she kept her thoughts to herself. She had no proof, no explanation, just the same feeling. Something wasn't right. Still, she didn't question it out loud. Maybe Ethan had trouble sleeping. Maybe he didn't sleep in his bed at all. Maybe he moved somewhere else at night. But why would no one notice? Why would no one care? Grace didn't know the answers yet, but she trusted her instincts. Until she understood more, she chose to stay quiet. For now, she focused on building trust with Ethan. If she rushed things, she might lose the little progress they had made. She would keep watching, keep listening. Something about this house felt off, but she couldn't point to one thing. It was just a feeling, growing stronger each day. And so even with the bed untouched and her questions unanswered, Grace stayed patient. It was still too early to say anything. One early morning, Grace woke up feeling thirsty. She got out of bed, put on her slippers, and walked quietly through the long hallway toward the kitchen to get some water. The house was silent, and the lights were dim. As she passed by the main entrance, something caught her eye. Through the shadows, she noticed a small shape next to the front door. She stopped and looked closer without making a sound. It was Ethan. He was curled up on a small wooden stool, asleep. He wore only socks on his feet and held a small teddy bear tightly in his arms. His head rested gently against the wooden door. Grace stood still for a moment, feeling a strange mix of sadness and confusion. Why would a child sleep by the front door? Why not in his bed? She didn't wake him up. She just stood there, watching him, trying to understand. That quiet scene stayed in her mind long after she walked away. The next morning, as part of her usual routine, Grace cleaned Ethan's room. She walked in, looked around, and went straight to the bed. Once again, it was perfectly made. The blanket was smooth, the pillow untouched, and there was no sign that anyone had slept there. Grace didn't need more proof. Now she knew the truth. Ethan wasn't sleeping in his bed at night. He was sleeping somewhere else. And last night, she had seen where. But why? She didn't say anything to anyone. Instead, she started to observe more closely. She adjusted her schedule and started waking up earlier. Every morning, before the other staff began their tasks, she quietly walked to the front of the house. And every time, she found Ethan in the same position, sitting on the stool by the door, holding the same teddy bear, asleep. Sometimes he had a blanket with him, sometimes not. But he was always there, always alone, always silent. It was becoming clear that this was his routine. Grace didn't know how long Ethan had been doing this. It could have been weeks, maybe months. She didn't understand how no one else had noticed. The house had security cameras, alarms, and night staff, but no one seemed to care about this detail. She didn't want to make a big scene, but the situation bothered her deeply. Ethan was a child. He should be sleeping in a warm, safe bed, not on a stool by the door. Grace tried to think of a reason. Was he waiting for someone, trying to leave, feeling safer near the exit? She couldn't guess. But she could see the truth in his actions. He didn't feel at home in his own room. He didn't want to sleep there. And nobody had realized it, except her. Each morning, after quietly watching him for a few minutes, she gently placed a blanket over his shoulders and walked away. She didn't want to scare him. She didn't want him to stop because of her. Days passed, and Grace couldn't stay quiet any longer. She knew that what was happening was not normal, and it wasn't right to ignore it. One afternoon, when she knew Richard was at home, she waited for the right moment. She saw him leaving his office and walking toward the stairs. That was her chance. She quickly stepped forward and politely asked if she could speak to him for a moment. Richard looked at her with his usual cold expression, but stopped. She told him what she had seen. She explained that Ethan had not been sleeping in his bed, that he slept every night by the front door, holding a teddy bear. She said she had seen it herself several times. She tried to explain that this was not just a strange habit, but a sign that something was wrong, that Ethan was scared or uncomfortable. Richard crossed his arms, looked away, and didn't say much at first. His face remained hard, showing no concern. Finally, Richard responded. He spoke in a firm and dismissive tone. He said that what Grace had seen was impossible. He told her that Ethan had everything he needed, that the boy had a comfortable bed, toys, doctors, and support. He didn't believe that Ethan would choose to sleep somewhere else. He accused Grace of imagining things, maybe even exaggerating because she was too involved. He made it clear that he didn't want to hear more about it. He said Ethan was fine and that she should focus on her duties. Grace tried to speak again, but he cut her off. He said that as long as Ethan was healthy and calm, there was no reason to question anything. Then he turned and walked away without giving her a chance to explain more. Grace stood there, frustrated and shocked. She had expected at least a little concern, but Richard had shown none. She realized it wouldn't be easy to get him to see the truth. After the conversation, Grace went back to her tasks, but she couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. His quiet movements, the untouched bed, the mornings by the door, it all meant something. She knew she wasn't imagining it. She had seen it with her own eyes. Every single morning. She also knew that Richard would not help. He was too focused on his own world to notice the reality in front of him. Grace didn't know what to do next, but she decided to keep watching Ethan. She would continue waking up early and checking on him. She would keep placing the blanket on his shoulders, even if no one else cared. Maybe she couldn't fix everything, but she could at least be there. She could show Ethan that someone saw him. Someone noticed. The house remained silent. The staff moved on with their routines, and Richard stayed cold and distant. And once again, the next morning, Ethan's bed was untouched, just like always. Grace knew exactly where she would find him. Even though Richard refused to listen to her, Grace didn't give up. She continued taking care of Ethan with patience and kindness every day. She didn't push him or ask him to act differently. Instead, she focused on making him feel safe. She greeted him every morning with a soft smile and gentle words. Slowly, Ethan began to respond. He didn't speak yet, but his behavior changed. He started watching her more closely and even stood closer when she walked by. He didn't run away when she entered the room. One morning, while she was cleaning the windows, he walked over and lightly touched her arm. Grace froze, surprised by the small gesture, but stayed calm. She looked at him and smiled. After that, Ethan became more open. He started smiling at her sometimes, short and quiet smiles that quickly disappeared. These small signs meant a lot to Grace. She knew they were progress. She knew he was starting to trust her in his own quiet way. Each day, their connection grew stronger. Grace began preparing special breakfasts for Ethan, simple meals with a touch of care. She made pancakes shaped like hearts and cut fruit into small pieces that were easy for him to hold. Ethan seemed to like it. He would sit near her in the kitchen while she cooked. Sometimes he touched the pancake before eating it. He also started following her outside during gardening time. Grace handed him a small watering can, and he learned to water the plants without needing instructions. She didn't speak much, only used calm gestures and soft encouragement. Ethan didn't speak either, but his eyes followed her closely. One morning after breakfast, he walked to her, sat on her lap without a word, and rested his head against her chest. Grace stayed completely still, her hands gently resting on his back. She didn't say anything, afraid to ruin the moment. That quiet connection meant more than words. From that day on, Ethan sat with her almost every morning. One afternoon, while Ethan was sitting at the table drawing with colored pencils, Grace was nearby folding laundry. He had been focused on his paper for a while, making soft lines and shapes. Then, without looking up, he mumbled something softly. Grace didn't hear it clearly at first. She stopped folding and walked closer. Ethan pointed to the figure he had drawn, a simple shape that looked like a stick figure with long hair. Then he said it again, more clearly this time. "Mommy." Grace stood still, completely surprised. She looked at the drawing, then at Ethan. He pointed at her and repeated the word, "Mommy." Her heart felt heavy, but she didn't cry. She knelt beside him and gave a small nod, not wanting to scare him. From that moment on, Ethan started calling her Mommy often. Sometimes it was while they were in the kitchen. Sometimes he whispered it while hugging her. Grace never corrected him. She accepted it. That word from his lips changed everything between them. Grace didn't expect that kind of bond to happen. She cared about Ethan from the beginning, but being called Mommy was something deep. She didn't take it lightly. She knew it came from a place of emotion, not habit. It wasn't just a word for Ethan. It meant safety, love, and comfort. And even though she wasn't his real mother, she treated him with the love of one. She gave him structure, attention, and affection. Their days became more connected. She learned what made him uncomfortable and what helped him stay calm. She knew when he needed quiet and when he was ready to try something new. All of this happened while Richard remained distant. He was often away on business trips or locked in his office with calls and papers. He never asked about Ethan's progress, never noticed the changes. The rest of the staff didn't seem to care either. They still saw Ethan as just a quiet boy who didn't speak. But Grace saw much more. Because no one else seemed to notice or care about what was really happening, Grace started writing everything down in a notebook. She kept track of Ethan's routines, including what time he woke up, what he ate, how he behaved during the day, and even the moments when he showed emotion. She also noted how he always slept near the front door, never in his bed. Each night, she quietly checked and wrote down the time and how he looked, what he was wearing, if he had the teddy bear, and if he had a blanket. These notes became her way of organizing everything she observed. She knew it wasn't normal, and she wanted proof. If anyone ever questioned her, she would be ready. No one else believed her stories. They thought she was exaggerating. Some even whispered that she was too involved. But Grace didn't care. She believed in what she saw. She believed in Ethan. She wanted to protect him, even if no one else stood by her side. While the house continued to function like nothing had changed, Grace stayed focused. She kept caring for Ethan with love, even when others doubted her. She never missed a detail. She kept her notes organized and up to date. Every time Ethan smiled, called her mommy, or followed her through the garden, she felt more confident that what they had was real. She didn't need anyone else to validate it. But deep down, she knew she had to do more. Something wasn't right in the house. Ethan's behavior, his sleep routine, Richard's distance, none of it made sense. Grace didn't want to confront anyone yet, but she was getting ready. She reviewed her notes every night and added anything new. She made sure she remembered every word Ethan said, every drawing, every moment of contact. And while Richard continued traveling and ignoring the signs, Grace kept preparing herself. No matter what anyone said, she knew what she saw. She was getting ready for the day someone would finally have to listen. It was a stormy night. The sound of heavy rain hitting the windows and the occasional rumble of thunder filled the air. Grace was sleeping lightly, already used to waking up early to check on Ethan. But that night, something felt different. A strong gust of wind shook the window in her room, and she sat up quickly. Her heart raced. She looked at the clock. It was just after 2 in the morning. She got out of bed and checked the hallway. Everything was quiet. She walked to Ethan's room and gently opened the door. The bed was empty, perfectly made, just like every other night. Panic grew inside her. She hurried down the stairs, checking the rooms one by one. When she reached the front entrance, her heart sank. Ethan was there, sitting on the small wooden stool, fast asleep. His hair and shoulders were wet from the rainwater leaking through the bottom of the door. He was holding his teddy bear, shaking slightly from the cold. Grace stood frozen for a second, completely shocked. The storm outside was strong, and water had started to gather on the floor near the door. Ethan's socks were soaked, and his thin pajama shirt was damp. He didn't wake up, even as water touched his legs. Grace immediately ran to him, crouched down, and gently placed her hands on his back. He didn't flinch. She reached for the blanket nearby, wrapped it around him carefully, and picked him up. She held him tightly against her chest and carried him to the kitchen, where it was warmer. After placing him on the sofa, she went back to the entrance, grabbed her phone, and returned to take a photo of the scene. The stool, the wet floor, and the open space under the door. She had seen enough. She needed proof. This wasn't just about neglect anymore. It was painful to witness. Something was deeply wrong, and Grace knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. By the time morning came, Grace had barely slept. She kept checking on Ethan, who remained quiet but calm. She gave him dry clothes and warm tea. He didn't say anything, but he looked at her more than usual, as if he knew she had seen him in that vulnerable moment. When the staff began their daily routines, Grace went to them one by one. She showed them the photo on her phone. She explained what had happened the night before. She expected concern, or at least surprise. Instead, most of them seemed annoyed or disinterested. One of the butlers, older and stiff, looked at the picture and gave her a suspicious look. He said she might be trying to use the situation to her advantage, to get Richard's attention or sympathy. The words shocked her. Another worker rolled her eyes and walked away. Grace felt anger building up. No one cared about the truth. No one wanted to believe that Ethan was suffering, even when shown real evidence. Determined, Grace went to Richard's office next. She waited outside until he finally appeared, walking down the hall while reading something on his phone. She stepped in front of him and held out her phone. "You need to see this," she said firmly. Richard didn't even look up. "Not now, Grace," he replied coldly. She insisted, saying it was important. He glanced briefly, didn't look at the screen, and walked past her. Grace followed him, still holding the phone. She described the night, the storm, the water, and how Ethan had been found soaked and shaking by the door. But Richard stopped, turned around, and said, "I don't have time for stories. My son is fine. He's always been fine." Then he left without another word. Grace stood in the hallway, shocked at his refusal to even look at the picture. She now felt that his ignorance wasn't just carelessness. There had to be a reason. Something deeper was keeping him from facing the truth. The more she thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. Richard wasn't just distracted. He was actively ignoring the situation. Grace began to wonder if there was something he was trying to hide, something about Ethan or the house that no one talked about. His reaction wasn't normal. A father should care. Even if he didn't know how to help, he should at least be concerned. But Richard wasn't. He didn't ask questions. He didn't want to know. That started to bother Grace in a new way. Her concern turned into suspicion. Maybe there was a reason he didn't want people near Ethan. Maybe there was more to the story than anyone had told her. The way the other staff avoided the subject, the way they dismissed her, it all felt planned, like they were protecting someone or something. Grace no longer believed this was just about neglect. There was a pattern. The indifference was too strong, too coordinated, and she wasn't going to let it continue. That night, after putting Ethan to bed in a room she had prepared herself, warm, dry, and far from the front door, Grace sat down at the table with her notebook. She flipped through the pages, rereading all her notes. Everything was there: the times Ethan was found by the door, the things he said, how he acted during the day, and how everyone reacted. She added the new event with full detail and attached the printed photo she had managed to get from her phone. She no longer cared if the others believed her or not. She wasn't doing this for them. She was doing it for Ethan. Richard had refused to act. The staff didn't care. But Grace was done waiting. She was tired of being ignored. Her doubts had turned into anger. If no one else was going to protect Ethan, she would. She closed her notebook, locked it in a drawer, and made a decision. She was going to act, with or without permission. She was ready. One morning, Grace received a surprising message. It came from Ethan's previous nanny, a woman who hadn't been seen at the mansion for months. The message was short and direct. She wanted to meet and speak in private. Grace felt curious, but also cautious. She agreed to meet at a small cafe in town during her afternoon break. When they sat down, the former nanny looked serious and tired, like someone carrying a secret for too long. She started talking immediately, saying she had also noticed strange behaviors in the Campbell house, especially with Ethan. She explained that she had gone to Richard many times trying to talk to him, but he always refused to listen. He acted like he didn't care, she said. Almost like he was angry at his own child. Grace listened in silence, her hands tight around her cup. It felt both painful and relieving to hear someone else confirm her thoughts. She wasn't imagining things. Something was truly wrong in that house. After returning home that day, Grace sat at her desk and opened her notebook. She looked at all the notes she had written over the past weeks, about Ethan's routines, his sleeping habits, his emotional progress, and the nights he spent by the door. She pulled out the printed photo she had taken during the storm, showing Ethan soaked and asleep by the entrance. Then she opened a folder where she had saved other pictures: the untouched bed, the clock showing early hours, Ethan on the stool, always with the same teddy bear. Each photo was a small piece of the puzzle. Grace began organizing everything. She wrote a cover page explaining who she was, what she had seen, and what she believed was happening. She attached the photos, the observation notes, and a printed version of the timeline. It was now a full report, detailed and clear. She didn't know what she would do with it yet, but she knew she had to be ready. There was no turning back. Throughout that week, Grace kept her routine as usual. She continued taking care of Ethan with the same calm and care. She cooked, cleaned, and guided him with her usual gentleness. Ethan had become more affectionate. He smiled more often and even started humming short melodies while playing. Grace wrote down those little changes. She knew they mattered. Meanwhile, she kept the dossier hidden in a locked drawer in her room. No one else in the house knew what she had done. She didn't mention the meeting with the previous nanny. She acted normal, waiting for the right moment. That same week, Richard returned from a business trip earlier than expected. His car pulled into the driveway in the middle of the afternoon, catching the staff by surprise. Grace saw him through the window, but didn't react. She continued her routine with Ethan, who was sitting quietly in the living room. It was one of those calm afternoons where everything seemed quiet on the outside, but heavy underneath. As Richard walked toward the house, he looked tired and distracted, carrying his briefcase in one hand. He opened the front door and stepped inside, expecting to be greeted by silence, as usual. But before heading to his office, something caught his attention through the glass doors that led to the garden. He stopped walking. There, just outside on the covered porch, he saw Ethan. The boy was asleep, his small body slightly bent forward on the wooden stool he always used. His teddy bear rested on his lap, and his head was tilted to the side. Beside him sat Grace, slowly and gently running her hand over Ethan's hair. She didn't notice Richard. She was focused on the boy, her expression calm and protective. Richard stood frozen in place, watching the scene without moving. For the first time, he was seeing it with his own eyes. Not a report, not a comment from a staff member, not something he could ignore. It was real and right in front of him. Richard didn't know how to react. He remained still, holding his briefcase tightly, his fingers pressing against the handle. He looked at Ethan, so small and vulnerable, sleeping outside in the middle of the day, not in his room, not in his bed. He noticed the way Grace touched him, not out of obligation, but with genuine care. Something stirred inside him, something heavy and uncomfortable. For years, he had kept himself distant. He had used his work, his travels, and his grief to stay away from the truth. He had convinced himself that Ethan was fine, that silence was normal, that routines were enough. But now, watching that quiet moment, he couldn't pretend anymore. He felt something crack inside him, a weight he had ignored for too long. Grace didn't look up. She didn't know he was watching. But that made it even more real. There was no performance, no act, just care. And for the first time, Richard felt completely unprepared to face what he had denied. He remained by the door, unable to step forward or turn away. Inside him, memories started to surface: his wife's death, Ethan's first days, the fear he never managed to face, and the guilt he buried so deep. Looking at his son now, asleep in someone else's arms, he realized how much he had missed. Not just moments, but years. Time he could never recover. The silence he had always accepted now felt unbearable. He saw the truth in that scene. Ethan wasn't distant by choice. He had been left alone. And Grace had filled a space Richard had refused to step into. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But something inside him broke. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the man in control. He felt like a stranger in his own home, a father who had looked away for too long. And as he stood there, unable to move, his world, built on denial and distance, finally began to fall apart. The next morning, Richard asked Grace to meet him in his office. His voice was firm and cold, and his eyes didn't show any emotion. Grace followed him without hesitation. She had been expecting this. Inside the office, the door closed behind them, and the silence was heavy. Richard stood near his desk, his arms crossed. "What exactly are you trying to do here?" he asked. Grace didn't flinch. She reached into her bag and placed a thick folder on his desk. Inside it were all the photos, notes, and daily records she had kept since the beginning. Everything about Ethan's behavior, the nights by the door, and the emotional progress she had witnessed. Richard didn't speak. He sat down and slowly opened the folder, flipping through the pages without saying a word. He looked at the pictures, read parts of the notes, but his face remained unchanged. When he finished, he closed the folder and looked up. "You're crossing a line. This is not your place," he said. Grace stood calmly, her hands folded in front of her. She didn't back down. "This is my place as long as Ethan is being ignored," she replied. Richard raised his eyebrows slightly, surprised by her boldness. "You're a housemaid, not a doctor, not a therapist. You were hired to clean, not analyze my family," he said, his tone sharper now. Grace didn't blink. She stepped closer to the desk and looked him directly in the eyes. "I didn't analyze anything. I just paid attention. I saw what no one else wanted to see." Richard stood up, clearly annoyed. "You're pushing too far. If you want to keep your job, stay in your place." Then, after a long pause, he added, "Otherwise, you can leave today." Grace took a deep breath and held her ground. "Your son sleeps by the door every night waiting for you to come home. He doesn't need reports. He just wants a hug." Richard went completely silent. He had no answer to give her. Still speechless, Richard turned away and walked toward the window. Grace waited, watching his back. She didn't know what he would say next, or if he would say anything at all. After a few seconds, he spoke again, but this time his voice was low and tired. "You don't understand what you're talking about," he said. Grace didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had said everything that mattered. A few moments later, she turned and walked out of the office, leaving the folder on the desk. As she stepped into the hallway, she immediately noticed Ethan. He was sitting on the floor near the stairs, gently playing with a small action figure. It was one of the toys Grace had given him weeks ago. He looked up when he saw her and smiled softly. Then they both heard the office door open. Richard stepped out and paused. Ethan looked at his father with a hopeful expression, waiting for something, anything. But Richard avoided eye contact and walked away. Ethan's smile faded slowly as he watched his father pass by without saying a word. Grace felt a tightness in her chest. She walked over to Ethan and sat down beside him. He didn't speak, but he leaned against her shoulder. She stayed there for a few minutes, quietly. Nothing needed to be said. The silence spoke enough. When Grace stood up again, she walked to her room. The rest of the day passed like usual, with the staff going about their work, as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. Grace knew it. Richard's reaction had made things clear. He wasn't ready to face what was happening, and maybe he never would be. Still, Grace didn't regret anything. She had told the truth. She had tried. That night, after making sure Ethan was asleep, she began gathering her things. She folded her clothes neatly, packed her small suitcase, and placed the folder with the records on top of her bag. She was prepared for the worst. As the evening went on, the house remained unusually quiet. No messages came. No one said anything about Grace leaving or staying. Richard didn't speak to her again. Dinner was served, and the table remained mostly empty. Ethan ate with Grace in the kitchen as usual. He didn't ask questions. He just looked at her from time to time, almost as if sensing something was different. After helping him get ready for bed, Grace sat by his side until he fell asleep. Then she quietly walked out of the room and sat alone in the hallway, unsure of what would happen next. Time passed slowly. Midnight came, and still, Richard had not returned. Grace looked at the front door a few times, half expecting to hear the sound of keys or footsteps, but nothing happened. The mansion stayed still. Richard didn't come home that night. Grace finally understood. His silence wasn't just a reaction, it was a choice, a clear, final rejection. She stayed quiet, but her decision was already made. By morning, Grace hadn't slept. She stayed up thinking about everything, about Ethan, about Richard, about what came next. She didn't know if she would be officially fired or if Richard would just ignore her completely from now on. But in her heart, she knew the truth. What she said was right. What she did was necessary. That day, she didn't pack more. She didn't rush to leave. Instead, she continued her routine. She made breakfast, cleaned up, and sat with Ethan during the morning. He didn't know what had happened, but he stayed close to her as always. Grace held back her emotions. She didn't want him to feel uncertain. Even though Richard's rejection had been strong and clear, she didn't regret confronting him. The problem wasn't hers to fix alone, but someone had to speak. And she had done that. No matter what happened next, she had looked him in the eyes and told him the truth. And now she was ready for whatever came next. Grace had reached her limit. After everything she had tried, conversations, photos, reports, and even confronting Richard, nothing had changed. No one believed her. People ignored what was right in front of them. She wasn't angry anymore. She was tired. Tired of watching Ethan sit by the door every night, waiting for someone who never came. Tired of being called dramatic or manipulative. That's when she decided to do something different. Quietly, without telling anyone, she placed a small camera near the front entrance. It was well hidden, tucked behind a decorative plant that no one paid attention to. She made sure it was angled just right, able to capture the stool, the door, and a clear view of Ethan's position. She didn't know what she was going to do with the footage yet, but she needed more than just her words. She needed proof that no one could deny. And so, she let the camera roll every night, hoping it would finally open someone's eyes to the truth. For 7 nights in a row, the camera captured exactly what she had been describing for weeks. Each recording showed the same heartbreaking routine. Just after midnight, Ethan would walk slowly into the hallway, still in his pajamas, holding his teddy bear. He would sit on the same wooden stool in front of the door. He wouldn't make a sound. He didn't cry or call out. He just sat there waiting. Sometimes he looked up, as if listening for a sound outside. Other times he stared down at the floor. After an hour or two, his head would begin to lower. He would curl up, still holding the bear, and fall asleep on the stool. The recordings were silent, but the message was loud. Grace watched each night's footage carefully and selected the clearest clips. She then compiled the material into a single video, only a few minutes long. No music, no narration, just Ethan, night after night, waiting at the door while the rest of the house stayed asleep. Grace didn't want to post the video online herself. She knew the risks of doing that, especially when it involved a child. But she remembered someone her mother used to know, a retired journalist who now ran a small, independent media site. Grace contacted her, explained the situation briefly, and asked if she would watch the video. The woman agreed. A few hours later, after seeing the footage, she called Grace back. "This speaks louder than anything you could ever say," she told her. Grace asked for one thing, that the story be shared without names, without locations, just the facts. The journalist respected that. Within days, a short article was published. It didn't mention the Campbell mansion or Richard's name. It simply described a boy who waited for someone every night. The video was embedded in the article. At first, it spread slowly, but soon it started appearing on social media. People began to share it, comment on it, and talk about what it meant and how it felt to watch. In just a few days, the video became viral. It was posted on parenting forums, shared by psychologists, and discussed in online debates. Some viewers wrote long threads about the emotional impact of the video. Others focused on the visible signs of emotional neglect. Many called it the boy by the door. Comments flooded in from people around the world. Some shared similar experiences from their own childhoods. Others criticized parents who ignored their children's emotional needs. Hashtags related to the video began trending. Still, Grace had kept her promise. No one knew the names behind the video. But it wasn't long before someone online noticed a detail. In one of the frames, a part of the household uniform was visible. A small badge on the sleeve of a staff member gave it away. Someone made the connection. They linked it to a known estate, a mansion owned by a wealthy businessman. That was all it took. People started digging. And soon, the anonymity behind the video began to fall apart. The attention quickly reached Richard. At first, he didn't take it seriously. He thought it would pass like any other story online. But when the media started calling and anonymous emails arrived at his company's inbox, he began to worry. Then came the shareholders. Members of his board of directors requested an urgent meeting. They had seen the video and recognized the boy. They asked Richard to explain. He said it was a misunderstanding, that the video was misleading, and that people online were overreacting. But no one seemed satisfied with his answers. Some questioned his personal life. Others asked why the boy was unsupervised at night. He couldn't control the narrative anymore. He couldn't buy silence or block the video. The story had grown beyond him. He realized that the truth was no longer something hidden in the corners of his house. It was now out in the open, spreading faster than he could manage. For the first time, Richard couldn't ignore it, cover it, or silence it. That week was different from any other in Richard's life. He had always been able to control problems with money, power, or distance. But now, the situation was public. The truth was visible to everyone. The image of his son waiting at the door had become a symbol. He didn't know what to do. The staff at the house acted nervous. The phone rang more than usual. Grace said nothing. She went on with her daily tasks like always, but she knew everything had changed. She had done what she needed to do. Not to expose anyone, not for revenge, but to protect Ethan. She had tried every quiet way first. No one listened. Now, the world was listening. Richard avoided eye contact. He barely left his office. He was no longer the man in control. He had been forced to see what he didn't want to see. And for the first time, the truth was louder than his silence. The truth had taken on a life of its own. After weeks of silence, Richard returned to the mansion. He arrived in the middle of the afternoon without announcing himself, surprising everyone. The staff looked at him but didn't say much. The house had changed since the video incident. People were more quiet, more careful. Grace was in the kitchen when she heard the door. One of the workers came to call her, saying Richard wanted to speak with her. She wiped her hands and went to meet him. He was standing in the hallway, looking different. His face showed exhaustion, not from work, but from something deeper. His shoulders were tense, and his eyes looked tired. When Grace approached, he asked if they could talk privately. She nodded. They moved to a small sitting room near the library. Once the door closed, Richard stood there for a moment before speaking. His voice was low, almost breaking. He said he was sorry, that he had come back because he couldn't live with the silence anymore, not Ethan's and not his own. Richard struggled to find the right words. He looked at the floor, then back at Grace. He explained that after his wife died, he shut down completely. He buried himself in work, in meetings, in responsibilities, anything that kept him busy. Being near Ethan was too painful, he admitted. Every time he looked at the boy, all he could see was the woman he had lost. Ethan reminded him of everything that had gone wrong. He couldn't face it, so he stayed away. He said it wasn't fair, but that's what happened. He said he thought if he kept a distance, things would fix themselves. But they didn't. The video had been a shock, not because of the public attention, but because it forced him to see what he had done. He said the boy in the video didn't look neglected, he looked forgotten. And that broke something inside him. Richard said he realized he hadn't just lost his wife years ago. He was slowly losing his son, too. Grace listened in silence. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer comfort, didn't say anything. She just stood there, letting Richard speak. He wiped his eyes once, but tried not to cry. He said he didn't expect forgiveness, and he didn't come back for praise. He came back because he wanted to try, maybe for the first time. He admitted he had no idea how to be a father, especially to a child like Ethan. But he didn't want to keep running. He said he had seen enough. Grace nodded slowly and asked him to follow her. Without saying another word, she led him through the hallway and into the living room. The room was quiet. Ethan was sitting on the rug, drawing on a sheet of paper with colored pencils. He was focused, calm, and unaware of what was about to happen. Grace stepped back, giving space. Richard paused at the entrance, his hands shaking slightly. He stared at the small boy, unsure if he should step forward. Ethan heard footsteps and looked up. When he saw his father, he froze. His pencil stopped moving, and his eyes followed Richard carefully. For a moment, the room was completely still. Then slowly Ethan stood up. He didn't run or smile, but he didn't step back either. He walked toward his father, one small step at a time. Richard didn't move. He just watched. When Ethan reached him, he lifted his arms, small, unsure, but open. It was the first time he had ever done that toward Richard. No words were spoken. Richard slowly lowered himself to his knees and opened his arms too. Ethan stepped closer and leaned in. Their bodies touched for the first time in a true embrace. Richard wrapped his arms around his son and pulled him close. He didn't speak, he just held him, and then finally the tears came. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet sobs as he held the boy he had avoided for so long. He didn't let go. Grace stood by the doorway. She didn't want to interrupt. She watched the scene unfold with a tight throat and blurry eyes. She had dreamed of this moment, but never thought she'd see it. It was simple, no speeches, no big reactions, but it meant everything. Ethan wasn't confused or scared. He stood still in his father's arms, accepting the hug, letting it happen. Grace knew it wasn't just about that one moment. It was about everything that came before. The silence, the rejection, the nights by the door, it all led to this. She had fought so hard to protect Ethan, not knowing if it would ever matter, and now it did. That quiet embrace showed her that change was possible. It wouldn't fix the past, but it was a beginning. She wiped her face gently and smiled to herself. For the first time in a long while, she felt hope inside that house. Not just for Ethan, not just for Richard, but for all of them. The embrace lasted several minutes. Richard didn't try to speak, and Ethan didn't move away. It was a silent agreement between them. A small bridge built out of something real. When Richard finally let go, he looked at Ethan's face. The boy didn't smile, but his eyes were calm. He picked up the teddy bear from the floor and placed it in his father's hands. Richard held it gently, unsure of what it meant, but honored by the gesture. Grace took a few steps back, leaving them space. She didn't want thanks. She didn't need recognition. Her work had never been about that. It was about giving Ethan what no one else did: safety, care, and patience. That day, something shifted in the house. Not loudly, not with big announcements, but something changed. The man who had once walked away without looking at his son had finally come back and knelt to hold him. And from across the room, Grace watched, quietly smiling, with tears filling her eyes. Months had passed since that emotional day in the living room. The Campbell mansion, once silent and cold, had changed. It wasn't sudden, but little by little, every room felt different. There was more movement, more warmth, more life. Richard, who used to avoid being home, now worked from the mansion 1 day a week. He cleared space in his schedule every Wednesday, turning the study into a temporary office where Ethan could sit nearby and play while he worked. On Sundays, Richard took Ethan to the park. Sometimes Grace went too. They didn't do anything extraordinary, just walked, watched ducks, or sat quietly on a bench. But to Ethan, those moments meant everything. He no longer waited by the door at night. Instead, he slept in his bed, covered with his favorite blanket, the teddy bear beside him. The stool by the door stayed empty now. It was no longer needed. The house that once felt like a hotel was finally becoming something more, a real home. Inside the house, other changes had taken place as well. Richard had hired a licensed occupational therapist, someone trained to work with children like Ethan. The therapist came twice a week, and her sessions included play-based learning, motor skills activities, and communication exercises. Ethan responded well. He was more engaged, more expressive. He still didn't speak much, but his gestures were stronger, clearer. He smiled more. He looked people in the eye longer. Grace helped guide him through the sessions and supported everything from meal routines to bedtime transitions. She was no longer just a housemaid. Richard officially promoted her to the position of head housekeeper, or, as most of the staff now called her, the person who ran the house. She had earned that respect. More importantly, she remained Ethan's source of emotional safety. He still called her Mommy, and now Richard didn't correct it. In fact, he supported it. That name had meaning. It was a connection built with time, trust, and love, and no one tried to change it. Grace didn't change her personality or try to take anyone's place. She stayed the same calm, focused woman who paid attention to details and made sure Ethan had what he needed. The staff also changed their attitude. Some who had once doubted her now followed her lead. The routines in the house were still structured, but there was more flexibility. The mansion didn't feel like a machine anymore. It felt like a place where people lived. Ethan's toys were no longer lined up with perfect precision. He still liked order, but now he allowed small changes. Sometimes he built towers. Other times, he created tiny scenes with figures from movies or animals. He even started choosing his clothes with Grace's help, something he had never done before. Every step, even the smallest one, mattered. And Grace recorded it all in a new notebook, not to prove a point, but to celebrate progress. She never raised her voice, never rushed things. She moved at Ethan's pace, exactly as she always had. One sunny morning, something simple happened that meant more than words could express. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing with colored pencils. Grace was preparing breakfast, and Richard was reading a report on his tablet. No one was talking, but the silence was comfortable. Ethan looked up and smiled. He went back to drawing, his little hand moving quickly across the page. After several minutes, he stood up, walked to the refrigerator, and stuck his drawing to the door using 2 small magnets. Then he stepped back and stared at it proudly. Grace and Richard walked over to see. The drawing showed 3 stick figures, all holding hands. One was labeled Me, the other 2 were clearly Grace and Richard. Simple lines, round heads, short legs, but the message was strong. Ethan had drawn his family. Richard looked at it for a long time, saying nothing. Grace placed a hand gently on Ethan's back. He looked up at her, smiled, and pointed at the picture again. That drawing stayed on the refrigerator door. No one touched it or moved it. It wasn't just a picture, it was a statement, a symbol of everything that had changed inside that house. Months ago, Ethan couldn't make eye contact. He barely reacted when spoken to. Now, he was drawing pictures, sharing his thoughts, and connecting with the people around him. The house had gone from emotionally empty to full of meaning. All the changes came because one person refused to ignore the silence. Grace had never demanded credit. She never raised her voice or asked for attention, but she had done what no one else had the courage to do. She listened. She noticed. She stayed. And because of that, a broken family began to heal. Richard didn't become a perfect father overnight. He still made mistakes, but he kept trying. Every week, every day. The drawing on the fridge became a quiet reminder of pain, love, and recovery. It reminded them where they had been and how far they had come. And so, in that large house that once felt like a place of shadows, something new had taken root. A quiet boy, once forgotten and invisible, now had a place where he felt safe. He didn't need to sit by the door anymore, hoping someone would come home. He didn't need to search for warmth in silence. He had found it. Grace still walked the halls, checking that everything was in order. But now she did it with a lightness in her steps. Richard had stopped running from his guilt and had started showing up, not just physically, but emotionally too. The family wasn't traditional, but it was real. Made from pain, rebuilt through effort. That morning, as the drawing remained on the fridge door, Grace poured juice into Ethan's cup and Richard handed him his plate. It was a small moment, but full of meaning. The woman everyone once ignored had healed what no one else could. And Ethan, the silent boy by the door, had finally found where he belonged. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe until next time.